Welcome to the debate. Today, we're opening a file that is as difficult to read as it is necessary to understand. We are turning our attention to a really profound narrative preserved in a memorial legacy, a detailed, almost forensic account of a family crisis that unfolded in February 2002. It involves a high-stakes medical evacuation from Kenya to London, a husband's battle against a brain growth, and, well, a tragic convergence of events on Valentine's Day.
And while the events are, of course, tragic, what makes this material so fascinating for our purposes is how it documents the human machine under extreme pressure. We're looking at a text that explicitly divides the experience into naming it, the narrative events, and taming it, the physiological reality. It's really an invitation to look under the hood of grief.
That is the core tension we're exploring today. When we look at this account, specifically the Valentine's legacy and the memorial speech, are we witnessing a spiritual triumph of human will, love, and what I would call conscious grace? Or, as my colleague suggests, should it be analyzed more as a clinical case study in trauma stacking, biological survival mechanisms, and just the sheer mechanics of how a body keeps breathing when its world collapses?
Right. I come at it from a different angle. I believe that relying on terms like strength or spirit actually obscures the neurological reality described right there in the text. I mean, the source material explicitly states the body doesn't feel grief, it survives it. To truly understand what happened to this family, and specifically to the mother, we have to strip away the sentiment and look at the cortisol, the adrenaline, the dissociation.
I see why you'd think that, but let me offer a different perspective. I represent the view that the source material demonstrates how character overrides circumstance. This is a story about a mother's deliberate dignity and a father's final act of love. It is about how meaning is constructed in spite of the biology.
And I represent the view that this is a textbook example of a nervous system in overdrive. I'll be arguing that what you call dignity is actually a biological freeze response, and that the events described are, really, a masterclass in how the brain buffers catastrophic information.
Okay, let's begin with our position statements. When I look at this material, I see a legacy of love that defies the medical odds, at least, initially. Consider the trajectory. This husband fought a brain growth in Kenya first. The text notes 3 successful surgeries. Each recovery was, and I'm quoting, proof that he was strong. By the time they made the decision to travel to London in 2002 for a 4th surgery, it wasn't an act of desperation. It was an act of hope. It was a refusal to accept the status quo.
But look at the context of that hope. You call it a refusal to accept the status quo. I call it allostatic load.
Allostatic load? You'll have to unpack that for us.
Think of it like the wear and tear on a car engine that's been running in the red zone for too long. Allostatic load is the cumulative cost to the body of adapting to chronic stress. You mentioned the 3 previous surgeries. That isn't just strength. That is a nervous system that has been in a state of high alert for years. So the decision to go to London involved chronic stress, massive financial sacrifice, and moving a sick man to a foreign country. That hope had a massive physiological price tag.
But that context just reinforces the commitment. They made a high-stakes decision, and the narrative culminates in a moment that is almost cinematic in its poignancy. On February 14th, 2002, Valentine's Day, despite his condition, the husband gave his wife flowers in a card. He walked her to the hospital door. The text says, he did not look like he was leaving this world. To me, this establishes that the human connection was the dominant force. And then, following his death, the mother navigated what the text calls an administrative war alone in a foreign country. That ability to function, to fight for his dignity even after his death, that is a triumph of the human spirit.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered what was happening under the hood? I want to draw attention to the tame it section of the source material. You see a journey of hope, but the biology sees a recipe for system collapse. The travel to London involved living in borrowed space. Do you know what that does to the brain?
It makes you feel unwelcome?
It removes the safety signals. Your brain is constantly scanning for threats because the environment isn't yours. The text explicitly lists elevated cortisol, adrenaline spikes, and sleep deprivation. Then you have the husband walking to the door on February 14th. You see that as beautiful. I see it as the setup for a neurological crash. The very next morning, February 15th, he was declared brain dead. The text describes this as a moment where time fractured. My argument is that this isn't just poetic license. This is a physiological shock. The brain cannot process the logical leap from walking husband to brain dead in 24 hours. What looked like strength in the mother, her ability to keep moving, was actually the nervous system freezing. It was survival mode kicking in, because the alternative was total biological shutdown.
I think we're getting to the heart of the disagreement here. So let's move into the core debate and focus on that specific transition, the nature of the final goodbye. You have Valentine's Day on one side and brain death on the other.
Right.
I firmly believe that the ordinary and beautiful nature of that last meeting on the 14th challenges your medical reductionism. The text says, he looked like my husband. He gave flowers. He walked. The advocate in me argues that this challenges the medical reality by suggesting the human connection was the truer reality of that moment. The memorial speech emphasizes that the last thing he gave was love, not despair. That choice to focus on the flowers and the walk is a conscious framing that transcends the biological failure of the brain. It suggests that the spirit can dictate the terms of the final memory, even if the body is failing.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. And let me tell you why. You are prioritizing the memory over the mechanism. We have to talk about pattern disruption.
Pattern disruption?
Yes, our brains are essentially prediction machines. We navigate the world by predicting what happens next based on what happened before. If a person walks, talks, and gives flowers, the brain predicts a life. It predicts recovery. When the reality shifts on February 15th, brain death, it is so radically different from the prediction that it causes a cognitive fracture. The text mentions the shock response, and brain death is medically final. It is distinct from a coma, it's distinct from paralysis. So the disconnect between him looking normal on Valentine's Day and being hooked to machines the next morning caused a massive error signal in the brain.
But the family accepted it. They dealt with it.
Did they, or did their brains buffer it? The source material uses a very specific example regarding the relative in the U.S. When the wife called the U.S. relative to say he was brain dead, the relative didn't understand. They thought it meant rehabilitation. They asked about wheelchairs.
The text suggests that was just a misunderstanding, hopefulness.
You call it hope. I call it a biological buffer. The text explicitly says the brain buffers catastrophic information so the body doesn't collapse. That misunderstanding wasn't ignorance, it was the nervous system refusing to accept a reality that broke the established pattern of recovery. The brain literally filters out the word death because it cannot integrate it with the data from 24 hours prior. It's a defense mechanism, purely to prevent the psyche from shattering.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. That buffering, as you call it, allowed the family to function. But let's look at the mother. She didn't have the luxury of a buffer. She was in the room. She was told to come to the hospital immediately. She had to navigate the administrative war.
Grief in borrowed space feels unstable, as the text notes.
Exactly. But look at how she handled it. She had to handle death certificates and transport clearance alone. And there is one specific piece of evidence in the text that I think dismantles the idea that she was just surviving. The airport incident.
Go on.
She is at the airport, flying home. Her husband is in the cargo hold. She's told her luggage is overweight. In that moment, she doesn't break down. She doesn't scream. She says, I am carrying my dead husband's belongings. The text describes this sentence as carrying shock, dignity, love, and disbelief. That is not a freeze response. That is a profound assertion of dignity. It represents the legacy of love coalescing into a verbal defense of her husband's memory. It's her saying, I am here and this matters.
I see that differently. I interpret that moment as clear evidence of dissociation. The text lists dissociation as one of the trauma mechanisms, feeling like you are functioning but not fully present. When she speaks to the airport staff, she's operating under immune suppression and sleep deprivation. She is enduring a bureaucratic endurance test.
But she spoke up. She advocated for him.
She stated a fact because her body was prioritizing immediate survival, getting on the plane, over emotional processing. Think about it.
If she had fully processed the emotions of that moment, the reality that her husband was in a box beneath her feet, she likely would have collapsed physically. The fact that she could stand there and deliver that line is proof that her body was shielding her from the full weight of the grief. She wasn't coping in the traditional sense, she was in a state of suspended animation to get the job done. The prefrontal cortex suppressed the limbic system to ensure she physically made the flight.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it strips the agency from her. It assumes the biology is the driver and she is just the passenger. But let's look at what happened next. Because if you think the airport was just biology, the next chapter challenges that even more. This is where the story becomes even more tragic and where I think the spiritual crisis really comes to the forefront.
You mean the return to Kenya?
Yes, the second shock. She arrives home expecting to bury her husband. Instead, she finds that her own mother has died.
The grandmother.
The grandmother died the next day after hearing the news. The text says she went into shock. The advocate's view here is that this represents faith under fire. The mother, the wife, had no bosom to cry into. That phrase is so specific. She had to bury her mother, then her husband. This frames the narrative as a test of the soul. It emphasizes the profound tragedy of aloneness. It's not just about stress, it's about the spiritual vacuum of losing your past, your mother, and your future, your husband, in the same week.
And this is where I have to insist on the clinical definition. This is the textbook definition of trauma stacking.
Trauma stacking. Explain that concept for our listeners. We hear trauma a lot, but what is stacking?
Imagine your nervous system is a bucket. The husband's illness filled the bucket halfway. The flight to London filled it more. The death filled it to the brim. Usually after a trauma, you need a reset window, a period of safety to empty the bucket. The text explicitly identifies this. Second death before processing the first. No reset window. This is incredibly dangerous neurologically. The nervous system was already overwhelmed by the husband's death, the travel, the administrative war. Then, without a moment to recover, a second massive trauma hits. The bucket overflows.
It's a compounding of grief, certainly.
It's more than grief. It's physical lethality. Look at the grandmother. The text says she went into shock and died the next day. That serves as proof of my position. Emotional distress is a physical event. I mean, in medicine, we look at things like Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, broken heart syndrome. The grandmother's body literally could not handle the data it received. And for the mother, returning to find her support system gone, that's not just sad, that creates a state where the body is flooded with cortisol and inflammatory markers with absolutely no outlet.
And yet, she stood. That is what I keep coming back to. By your definition, the bucket overflowed. The grandmother died from the shock. But the mother stood.
She stood because the alternative was death.
I would argue she stood because of the outcome for the children, which brings us to our final point of debate. You look at the trauma stacking and see damage. I look at the result and see resilience. The text says the children are now whole, educated, breathing, functioning.
Functioning is the key word there. It's a very functional word.
It's a victorious word. The tragedy reshaped their love into ambition and responsibility. The mother became the emotional spine of the family. The memorial speech says, if we are standing here today, it is because she stood when she could have fallen. That implies a choice. It implies that the transcending of the trauma was an active, conscious process, not just a biological accident. She took that pain and transmuted it into a future for her children.
That's a compelling argument, and I don't deny her achievement. But have you considered the cost mentioned in the closing prayer?
Which part?
The text explicitly mentions healing what trauma marked in their nervous systems. Even the prayer acknowledges the biology. It talks about the ache that reshaped their lives and the end of childhood innocence. My argument is that while they are educated and whole, which is remarkable, the cost was a permanent shift in their biological threat detection systems. You mentioned anticipatory stress earlier.
Yes, the text notes it was active during the illness.
Exactly. When a developing brain goes through that level of trauma stacking, losing a father and a grandmother in a week, it wires the brain to be constantly on guard. It creates hypervigilance.
They are successful, yes, but often high achievement is a coping mechanism for anxiety. It's a way to control the environment so you never get hurt again. That threat detection system is likely permanently dialed up to high.
But the text also asks to soothe the memories that still sting and chooses gratitude. We release bitterness, we choose gratitude. That is a cognitive, spiritual restructuring of the event. They aren't denying the nervous system impact, they are choosing to override it with meaning. That's what humans do. We tell stories to make sense of the pain.
You can overwrite the meaning, but you can't delete the code. The text says Valentine's Day 2002 changed our family forever. It split life into before and after. That is the language of trauma. It suggests that the pattern disruption I mentioned earlier became the new baseline. The fact that they are successful today is a testament to their ability to manage that new baseline. But we shouldn't pretend the baseline didn't shift. The innocence was lost.
I think we are nearing a synthesis here. You see the shifted baseline as a scar. I see it as the foundation for their legacy. Let's move to our conclusion. As we wrap up this analysis, I want to re-emphasize my stance. While the biology is real, and I don't deny the cortisol or the shock or the adrenaline, the meaning comes from the choices made despite that biology. The decision to view February 14th not as a day of loss, but as a day where love was the last thing expressed, is a triumph of the mind over the traumatic event. The text says he did not leave this world unloved. That is the truth they chose to hold.
And I will conclude by saying that acknowledging the biological reality, the cortisol, the shock, the trauma stacking, it doesn't diminish the mother's legacy. In fact, I think it makes her survival more impressive.
How so?
Because it wasn't just willpower in some abstract sense. It was a victory over biological collapse. The grandmother's death proves how deadly that shock could be. It shows the stakes. The fact that the mother survived the bureaucratic endurance test and the double bereavement without a reset window is a physiological marvel. She navigated a minefield of stress hormones that could have stopped her heart, and she came out the other side.
It seems we agree that the event was a watershed moment.
Absolutely. It split life into before and after. That is indisputable.
And perhaps the most powerful takeaway from this source material is that the family refused to let the trauma be the only story. They balanced the ache that reshaped their lives with the gratitude for love. They named the trauma, but they also tamed it.
They acknowledged the nervous system. They didn't hide from the pain, but they didn't let it dictate the ending. There is certainly more to explore in this material regarding the long-term effects of such acute stress on the next generation, but the resilience is undeniable.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into A Valentine's Legacy.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time on The Debate.